Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Asia House. This event is part of the Asia House Bagri Foundation Literature Festival, which is running until the 6th of November. Please do check out our full program on asiahousearts.org, or you can pick up a program in reception. I'm delighted to welcome our speakers for this evening, George Magnus, former Chief Economist of UBS and author of the new book, Red Flags, Why China is in Jeopardy. He is joined by the columnist, broadcaster and speaker Martin Jacques, who is also the author of the global bestseller When China Rules the World, The End of the Western World and the Birth of the New Global Order. They are joined by Dr Yu Jie, who is head of China Foresight at LSE. Moderating this event will be Dr Linda Yueh, author of The Great Economists, How Their Ideas Can Help Us Today, and an economist at Oxford University and London Business School. Both George Magnus and Linda Yueh will be signing copies of their books after this talk. There'll also be a chance for you to ask your questions at the end. If you'd like to tweet tonight, we're at Asia House Arts, and our hashtag is AsiaLitFest. So without further ado, please join me in giving a very warm welcome to our speakers for this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Anna and to Asia House for having us here this evening. As Anna says, you're very welcome to tweet. The hashtag is AsiaLitFest. And of course, we look forward to having your comments and your questions. With about 20 minutes to go in this hour-long session, the floor is going to be open. And I know, having given a talk on my book last Thursday, some of you, it's nice to see you back here. The audience has fantastic questions, so we very much welcome that interaction. So how the session is going to run is each of the panelists are going to start with a few moments to give you their take on the question for the evening, which is China's new era, progress or jeopardy. And then we're going to have a little debate amongst ourselves and then to draw you in, and we will be finished in about an hour's time. There will be drinks next door, as well as copies of George's book and also my book, and we look forward to having a chat with you as well over the book signing. So without further ado, I'm going to now hand over first to George. The publication of his book is the reason why we're gathered here this evening. And so we're going to get George to talk us through why his book is titled the way it is. Let me remind you of the title, Red Flags, Why China is in Jeopardy. And he's also going to set out a few topics that we're going to toss around in this conversation. So let me hand it over to George.
Thank you, Linda. And very good evening. I hope that I'm not going to... Actually, I was going to say I hope I could have the drink now, actually, because I'm just sort of going through early motions of a cold. Anyway, red flags, self-explanatory, really, isn't it? Red flags are about warnings. So the book is really about some warning signs in contemporary China about problems that they face. Who doesn't? But China has its own kind of fair share. And why China is in jeopardy, I should say straight off, actually, I'm not predicting, and I'm not even discussing really the long-term future of the political system in China. I assume it's going to carry on for the foreseeable future. But I think that why Seize China makes it into my title is because I think something really quite dramatic has changed in the governance of China since 2012. So the book really kind of begins with a kind of very easy to read kind of explanation, partly looking back in history, century of humiliation, partly at China's history from 1949 to the present day, at three remarkable transformations. So the first transformation in China really was from being a customer to the world to becoming a very feisty competitor and to becoming now, as we know almost every day from the newspapers, an adversary, certainly of the United States and of other Western economies as well, in trade, in investment relations, in technology, in military prowess, and so on and so forth. The second big transformation was really in the economy. So China was fulfilling almost all of the expectations that emerging countries or developing countries should fulfill, but in spectacular and unprecedented style. Many of the things that we kind of associate with China's achievements in terms of education, in terms of manufacturing, in terms of labor transfer, and so on, all of these things were accomplished in great and very, very effective style, but in the context of what was a continuously reforming economy. So this year, as you know, has been the 40th anniversary of reform and opening up. And it's really from about 1979, 1980 onwards that the Chinese economy really begins to motor in a very, very material way in terms of catch up on the rest of the world. So that all happened, but actually more recently things have started to go a little bit more, have become rather more difficult. So don't take my word for it. So in 2007, for the first time, when Zhao referred to the economy as being unbalanced, uncoordinated, unsustainable, and he said it again actually before he stepped down from office in 2011. And even as recently as last year at the 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping, in kind of giving his blessing really to the change in the Communist Party's central contradiction, basically alluded or referred to the economy as being unbalanced and inadequate to meet the people's needs for a better quality of life. So there are some quite particular problems that I think the Chinese economy has run into after this extraordinary 3 or 4 decades, which are widely recognized at the very senior echelons of the party, but also, of course, outside as well. And the third transformation really, I'm not going to spend very long talking about it, we can do that, of course, is the transformation is China's perception of itself in the world. So, as you know, under Deng Xiaoping, the maxim of hide your capabilities and bide your time was kind of a mantra that was effectively ingrained in the Chinese governance system until probably around 2011, 2012. And more recently, of course, as you saw in the Congress, 19th Party Congress last year, and in the National People's Congress in March, China has been much more vocal, much more assertive, a little bit more truculent. So all of these changes together, I think, give us a perspective or an insight into China which is not the China that we really grew up with. It has changed in some very material respects. So the book basically then goes on to discuss some very significant issues which the government has to try to deal with. So debt is the most pressing issue. Related to that is the stability and internationalization of the renminbi, where I argue that actually neither of these two can be guaranteed the way things are set up at the moment. The third issue is demographics. China is the fastest aging country on earth, not the oldest, which is Japan, but it is the fastest aging country and will be older on many metrics than, say, the United States by 2040. And it's doing this aging in a fraction of the time that it took us to do it. So the phrase, getting old before you get rich, was almost made up for China, because what we did in terms of the age structure of our societies in about 50 to 80 years, China will do in about 20, at lower levels of income per head. And the final trap is the so-called middle income trap, which we could talk about for ages, but obviously we don't have time here in the introduction. But it's about basically having made the transition from being a poor country to a middle income country, how does it make the transition from being middle income to being a rich country? And this is really all about the quality of institutions and about gearing up for a different way of generating productivity. The last section of the book really is about much more contemporary and much more widely known phenomena, which are almost in the headlines or newspapers every day. One is about trade, the other is about Belt and Road. So the trade issue, I think, two things I'll just say about that. We can, again, get into this later. One, this is not an ordinary trade row like the Americans are having with the Mexicans and the Canadians. This is an existential argument about technology leadership, about military superiority, and about the rules and regulations of industrial policy. This trade spat is going to go on for the foreseeable future. I don't really see an off-ramp at the moment. There will probably be one at some point in the future. Somebody is going to have to climb down covertly and make concessions on something, but it doesn't look like it's going to happen for the time being. And I think, perhaps controversially, that nobody's a winner in a trade war. Everybody loses. But I actually think hubris in Beijing actually allowed them to come into this trade row with Trump in unprepared fashion. And I think they've now pretty much run out of options in terms of combating tariffs with the United States. And they have to think about other things they can do to try to hit back at their adversary. And the Belt and Road, finally, really is an ongoing debate, really, for which there is no conclusion as yet, which is it a Eurasian development project that's setting up a new development model for the world, or is it something that's very China-centric in terms of who benefits? Benefits Western provinces, it benefits the sale of manufacturing and brands and products to emerging and developing countries, and obviously it's a source of releasing excess capacity and so on and so forth. So it also has, as we know from the experiences of Malaysia and Pakistan that have been publicized this year, many financial problems and debt problems have accrued to a lot of emerging countries. So this is the narrative of the book, and there is obviously a conclusion which I'm not going to reveal at this point.
We'll get it out of you by the end.
You will.
Thank you very much, George, for that terrific scene setter, and lots of issues to discuss. Martin, let me turn to you and get your take on the question that we're going to look at this evening: China's new era, progress or jeopardy?
Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that, China's economic transformation, especially since 1978, is most extraordinary. I think unparalleled in certainly modern economic history, but you can take it back probably a lot further than that. I think generally Western politicians and intellectuals have found it extremely difficult to come to terms with it. By and large, economists have been very skeptical about the possibility of it being sustained, and the great majority of people have believed that because the political system was not like ours, a Western-style democracy, then it could not be sustained and it would eventually hit the wall. And of course, as a result of this, generally the Western climate opinion has got China wrong with extraordinary consistency. And I think that certainly the things have shifted. George, I'm glad to say, although I disagree with a fair number of things in his book, is not of this school of thought in this book. He doesn't express this point of view. But I think that one of the great problems is because China is profoundly different from Western society, and the West has been hegemonic for so long, that the way in which people try and understand and make sense of China is essentially through a Western paradigm. This is the great problem, and you cannot do this with China. And here I have reservations about George's book, because, to even make sense of China's economic transformation, I think you've got to take into account, not just discuss history as a narrative, but you've got to confront the question that China is not any kind of conventional nation state. It was a civilization state that became a nation state, in a manner of speaking, from the end of the 19th century, and the two coexist. And the two different elements draw and shape Chinese foreign policy to this day. And so I think we face an enormous intellectual challenge in the West to understand China, because we constantly try and measure China against ourselves. We try and make China be like us. We expect China to do what we've done. And China hasn't done that, except in certain respects, and I don't believe will do. Now, in terms of Xi Jinping and so on, well, clearly it's true that Xi Jinping era, starting in 2012, marks some kind of shift. I don't want to exaggerate it. I don't go as far as George does on this question. I don't think you can classify him as a dictator. I don't think he runs China single-handedly. He's certainly more powerful than Hu Jintao. He's more powerful than Jiang Zemin. He's not more powerful than Deng Xiaoping, even though Deng Xiaoping for a long time actually held no single office, but was actually called the paramount leader. So I think that, but I do think that there have been two singular shifts, I think, since Xi Jinping. Well, one of them, I'd say three, because George is right in the book to single out and consider at some length what the economic challenge is to China now that it's got to shift its model, its economic model, and I think that's absolutely true. Secondly, I think the shift is a big historical shift, which is now that China feels strong enough to express itself in terms of its foreign policy and its international position. You see, hide your capability, which was a brilliant strategy that came from Deng Xiaoping, was a function of China's weakness, long-running weakness coming from the century of humiliation. You see, by the end of the 19th century, China had, it was a brilliant sentence, brilliant expression by the American sinologist, now dead, unfortunately, Lucien Pai, who said, China is a civilization masquerading as a nation, forced by its own weakness at the end of the 19th century to adapt to the European norms of the international system. And in a way, what the Xi Jinping era marks is the beginning of addressing that question, which is a very big historical question. And I think that, so you have to see him in much broader terms than, you know, and this question cannot be resolved in a simple way now. I think you would like me to stop, but I'm going to say one more thing, because I can see you getting agitated, and I know that's a warning. And that is, there's a very loose, and George is partly guilty of this, of saying, well, China's assertiveness, it's throwing its weight around, it's being adversarial. You know, I mean, this is a country that, of 1.4 billion people, it is now the first or the second largest economy in the world, however you look at it, which historically has had a bad time, at least from the early 19th century, a very bad time. And it's risen with extraordinary speed. Now, excuse me, compare China's behavior since that process started in 1978 with the equivalent periods in American history, in British history, in German history, in Japanese history. All of them fought lots of wars. China has not basically fought a single war apart from small border conflicts. So we should recognize that China actually has been extremely responsible about its rise and the nature of that rise, and I don't think that's about to change.
Thank you very much, Martin. So Cherry, you requested to go last, so you get the last word on the opening round between these two, sitting between them, appropriately I should say, on this question of China's new era since President Xi Jinping came into office in 2012. Is it progress or is it jeopardy?
Right, Linda, obviously you asked me that impossible question on which camp I should side in here. So which camp I should choose, I really don't know. I mean, ever since the collapse...
Perfectly balanced answer, yeah.
So ever since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the entire world has been predicting that China will follow the same path, and China's Communist Party going to collapse as well. But it seems to be that it did not happen, and the party just has getting strong and strong forever. So, I mean, if I can draw a line from Theresa May, and she was talking about strong and stable government, and about British government, and I think she hasn't had it, but Xi Jinping really has it all for the moment so far. So that's the scenario where we are now. And if we are trying to making any prediction for China, is that sense of impossibility in here. So I'm not making any prediction. So when you're talking about, we cannot understand China from the lenses of Western angle, but I think there's certain element, irrespective whatever the political systems we are in, the three elements which are essentially authority, liberty, and the wealth. So these are the three elements. Apparently any political system have to answer that question to its own people. But in China's case nowadays, is that sense of course we have authority, and of course we have that certain level of wealth and prosperity creation. But then when they come to the question on liberty, and that would be really a big question for Xi Jinping, what he wants to do on the libertarian side of the thing. So perhaps you may disagree with me, but I'm just simply saying these are the three elements of any political system for any political leaders have to answer at the end of the day. So that's one part of it. Now, we come to this whole marriage of authority vis-a-vis liberty, or vis-a-vis wealth. So when we're talking about China, after 1979, the entire social contract is based on the government creating a sense of personal, individual prosperity to individuals, and therefore, and that's something the government would deliver, and then you do not question the political value, you do not question the political system. And certainly, that's where we are now, and we cannot do that. I mean, I can clearly see Xi Jinping himself even become much more and more aware of the public opinion. Many of people ask me, what does the anti-corruption campaign entails in China? And my answer has always been, anti-corruption campaign in China is the equivalent populist agenda like in the West, for example. That's a part of the political purge, but also part of the answer to his own people. We try to somehow clean up the party. And he's trying to establish his own reputation for that. So that sense of populist agenda also play alongside with the Chinese Communist Party. And that's perhaps, in this part of the world, many of you did not really aware from the beginning. So that's the Communist Party regime you have. And then now we come to the question on responsibility and the social contract. And I think what we have to agree is, irrespective of what kind of political system you have, but at the end of the day, it's really the accountability to his own people that matters, and whether Xi Jinping and his regime will succeed or not, and that is his task in his second and third term. And I know maybe you two disagree with me on many points, but I just open up the debate in here. As for the picture on China, it cannot really be black or white. It's a blurred picture, and I think we really require a nuanced reading for the return of the Middle Kingdom in here.
Thank you very much, Sherry. George, I'm going to give you a chance, obviously, to come back on some of these points raised by both Martin and Sherry. I think anything that you want to focus on, I think I should just give the floor to you to do so.
Okay, thank you. I mean, we're just two or three things, and there'll probably be others will crop up in our discussion and with the audience. I wasn't being critical about China being assertive and truculent. I was just making the observation that it is. And my point really is that for just looking at it from the point of view of what actually does that mean, because obviously the world has changed since China was a more kind of a weaker economy, a weaker state, and didn't have the trying to think of the polite word. Didn't have the sort of the strength of purpose really to make its presence manifest in the world. So it wasn't really being critical. It was just a sort of an observation that we are in a much more adversarial world nowadays, and obviously there is an inequality of status or perceived status, which I think lies a lot behind some of the problems that are playing out. A couple of other things that I just kind of made a quick note of. You did. You did make the point, and a lot of people do make it, that you have to look at China through China's eyes rather than through Western eyes, and we make often mistakes, trying to put our own templates on what China should or shouldn't do. My point about China being in jeopardy is really kind of an observation about China using its own metrics and its own standards. So one of the things, if I can kind of debase the conversation by just talking about economics just for a bit.
You aren't an economist.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah,
you
should
I'm not unproud of
the flag.
I'm not unproud of it, but I just don't want you to fall asleep. So.
Jargon free, please.
But one of the things that I kind of draw attention to in the book, and which I've been very conscious of for a while, is that China has had these kind of spurts of productivity growth. So in my really nerdy world, right, we have a concept that we call total factor productivity. Don't faint, it's not really that complicated. It's the bit of efficiency in economic growth accounting that comes about for reasons that we can't calculate. We know something about how we calculate labor input into a growing economy. We know quite a lot of things about how you account for the growth of capital accumulation in an economy. But nevertheless, sometimes the whole is bigger than the sum of the parts. And basically, economists have this term to describe that, which is called total factor productivity. Yeah. It's basically a term about efficiency and about innovation and
so
technical progress and so on.
So the portion of growth you can't, the portion of growth, if you have an economic growth rate of say 9%, you can attribute that to adding workers, adding skilled workers, adding capital, but there's a portion that can't be explained.
Thank you.
So we call that TFP.
Right. And so looking at China's history, economic history, after 1949, we can identify very clearly phases when this form of productivity surged. And these phases, basically, the first one comes in the 1980s with agrarian reform and town-village enterprises and so on and so forth. The second phase comes under Zhurongji and the state-owned enterprise reform and effectively the privatization. And the third comes in the years following joining the World Trade Organization, because a lot of economic reform was done in preparation for joining the WTO and then in the wake of that event as well in 2001. And then in between times, things go off the boil. So there is a correlation really between moments in China's economic history of greatest economic efficiency and growth and prosperity, which are linked quite closely to what we might call liberalizing economic reforms. I'm not making any allusions here to who are the reformers or whether reform means the same in China as it does for us, but where you shift the balance very starkly in favor of creating markets, however controlled they may be, you get an efficiency feedback from that. And the problem that I'm kind of identifying under the current government is that since the kind of surge of bank lending that took place in the initial phase of the reaction to the financial crisis in 2008, China's kind of productivity growth defined in this way has basically been very pedestrian. And actually, the reason for that, I think, is because the whole reform and opening up thrust has basically been lost or diluted. And I'm just not confident that, I mean, it could be somebody else's China will actually make amends in a very material way. I'm just not confident that Xi Jinping's China is going to be able to do that.
Well, let's put this point to you, Martin, in terms of Xi Jinping's China on these metrics that George has pointed out, both in the description of productivity growth, but also in his opening comments around the internationalization of the RMB, making the RMB an internationally traded currency, the Belt and Road Initiative, all of these things which you could describe as a country which has become a middle-income country, second biggest in the world, setting a place for itself. Do you think that this is progress, or are there elements of this under the Xi Jinping regime that you think could put China in jeopardy?
Well, first of all, I think it's progress in the sense that China is 20% of the world's population and has been basically powerless for 2 centuries and invisible and unheard. And now this very old civilization, very rich culture, very interesting country is beginning to reflect that fact in its presence and influence in the world. What do I think about that? I think that's really good. Because I think a world that was dominated by such a small sliver of humanity for 2 centuries, namely the North Atlantic, basically Western Europe and North America, was deeply unrepresentative of the world. This was an authoritarian era of international relations. So I think that is progress, historically speaking. Belt and Road, this is a long discussion, and George has got an interesting chapter on it. I think that Belt and Road is progress. And the reason is because I think that China sees itself as a developing country. It understands the problems of development in a way that, quite frankly, Western countries don't. I mean, China could never have come up with something as like the Washington Consensus. It has an affinity with and an intimacy with the problems of development. It, of course, makes lots of mistakes. It made mistakes in Africa. It'll make lots of mistakes with Belt and Road. But basically, I think China's had an extremely positive influence with regard to Africa. And I think it's helped Africa in a way that the Western countries have never helped Africa. And with Belt and Road, I think China can, if China can make a singular contribution to the transformation of particularly the developing countries in the Eurasian landmass, it will transform the world in an extremely positive way. Is there still a hanging thing that I didn't answer?
No, that was great. I think we've now gotten the 2 views. Now it's Cherry's turn.
Right.
I'm going to ask you a slightly different question,
Sure.
Cherry, which is the Xi Jinping era progress or putting China in jeopardy vis-a-vis earlier Chinese presidents?
Well, it depends what you judge by success or jeopardy to that extent. I mean, Chairman Mao actually obviously saved the country, united the country, and Deng Xiaoping saved the economy, and of course Xi Jinping saved the party. And that's the standard line for any sinologist would give you for that answer. And that's exactly what Xi Jinping is trying to do now. And I think what we, in this part of the world, did not really aware of Xi Jinping is he felt that sense of historical duty that he obliged to lead the country, obliged to bring the country back in the rightful status for the international world, international community. Of course, that sounds very intimidating because of his, very strident move on constitutional changes and his very strident move on Belt and Road Initiative. But everything have to come within the consequences. You can think about China back to 1970, late 1970. Whatever China does, or whatever China did, and it really got unnoticed by the rest of the world. But putting nowadays in situation, whatever China does now attracts so much attention. So I think it's really in that level, in that period, and in the process of delivery, because what, on the one hand, China has certain intentions, but on the other hand, you have that sense of capability somehow is lacking, and that therefore does not really translate into the consequences that which China intended to do. And then that's where they break up, and that's where the dispute and debate happen between China and West. I mean, I wouldn't call that irreconcilable, but I mean, that's really, if you look into a long historical period, is that sense of capability China hasn't really yet equipped with by being a great power, but on the other hand, have the great power ambition. And then that really putting the conflicts between the two sides become greater and larger.
Thank you. I'm just going to go around for your kind of final thoughts before we open it to the audience. I think we've touched on a number of bases, but I think it'd be very good to get each of you just to, in a very kind of short synopsis way, talk about whether you think China's growing external influence. A few words on that under Xi Jinping. What are the kinds of touch points you're looking at? Conflict, cooperation, what are some of the dynamics around not just the Belt and Road Initiative, but the rise of China, the emergence of China economically, the trade wars. I think placing Xi Jinping's China in a global context, I think would be really interesting. George.
Well, thanks. I mean, I'm certainly very happy to row along with the view that the economic emergence of China is unquestionably a good thing for the world. So no disputes about that at all. In terms of its external impact, I think my most immediate focus, obviously, because it is very topical, is really about the trade conflict, but the trade conflict isn't specifically about trade, it's about all the things underneath that I was referring to. And I think that the danger is, I mean, I know there's always a sort of a bit of whataboutery that goes on here, because we're talking about China, and we can't really talk about adversarial conflict without talking about the other adversary as well, of which there is a lot to say. But this is sort of specifically about China. So what I'm anxious about really is about how China reacts and behaves in the next kind of months and years in a situation which it's quite difficult for them to choose the appropriate response. Because as we know, Beijing does have form in the past where it's had political arguments with different countries. It has sometimes targeted the companies of those countries, so South Korea, Japan, Philippines, even Norway, sometime a little bit further back over the Peace Prize. So what I'm kind of interested really is about how the government may now choose to combat the United States, particularly if Trump widens the tariffs to the entirety of imports from China. What will the Chinese do? Will they target American companies in a way that might be self-harming? Because actually American companies, foreign companies contribute quite a lot to the Chinese economy and to technology and so on. So this is a kind of a tension point in terms of international relations, which I think is quite difficult to see how it will, as I said before, how we get to the off-ramp, and whether there's some kind of covert way in which the two presidents can eventually try to cool the dogs off, basically, and make concessions to one another. The other thing about the Belt and Road, I mean, I also think that the IMF and the World Bank have performed a very credible job in the last kind of 40 or 50 years, but they also have kind of structural flaws and weaknesses which China is trying to remedy, because who in their right mind would say no to Chinese financing of highways or dams or airports and high-speed rail and so on and so forth. So this is, I mean, it would be churlish to say anything other than it's a positive contribution to global development, with the caveat that there are charges about China's behavior in Africa which verge on the colonial. I mean, if you think about, if a country or a project gets so deeply into debt that the resolution of it is that China takes over management of that project, that's basically what we used to do too.
No,
So-
we used to run them.
Well,
We actually took them over.
well,
the
that's what
country.
they've done in Sri Lanka.
That's not true.
Okay.
That is not true.
I think they took a 100-year lease on Sri Lankan.
Yeah, there's a
Sri
99-year
Lankan
lease
port.
on the port.
Yeah, that we actually occupied these countries.
Okay,
We formed their government. We required the population to speak the language, to adopt Christianity. That was colonialism.
okay.
It has an historic meaning. It's not something to be bandied around just as a phrase, which is derogatory.
Well, I'm really only talking about the commerce, though.
Well,
Okay.
colonial is not the term colony is not just a commercial phrase, is it? It has a political meaning.
Okay, but that's a debatable point. I mean,
No,
there are
it's a-
African leaders who have actually made that point as well. So I mean, anyway, the point I was wanting to make really is that the Belt and Road Initiative is not without its flaws. It's not just mistakes. It's fundamental flaws, and about saddling countries with large amounts of debt that they probably cannot pay back. So, I mean, I've looked at about, 18 countries that have had debt to GDP since 2016. So that's in 2 years. Their debt to GDP has gone up by between 20 and 30%. This is not necessarily, kind of a positive contribution to development. So I'm just saying, we in the West may have made, a big hash up of, our development initiatives in parts of the world. I'm just saying that China is not necessarily bettering itself in terms of its current strategy and behavior. So it's nuanced. Everything is nuanced. It's great to have new infrastructure. It's not good to get deeply into debt.
Okay. Martin, let me let you come back on that for your final.
Yeah, I've
I
made
think-
my point. Oh, sorry, I took some of
Okay.
your time.
The,
I think that if you take the countries that have been involved so far, got into difficulty with Belt and Road, Myanmar, Sri Lanka, Malaysia are 3 examples. I bet you anything that the Malaysians will sort it out favourably for themselves because Mahathir is a tough guy and the Chinese don't want to fall out with him. So, and I think that as has happened in Africa, quite a number, I don't know how many, but a number of the agreements have been renegotiated because they felt that they'd been on adverse terms and so on. So I think there's a learning process going on in relationship to this, which is very important to the Chinese are very good learners, and they're very pragmatic.
Venezuela was a good lesson.
Well, they've lost a lot of money in Venezuela, that's for sure.
Libya is another lesson.
I mean, I just want to, can I say something about the trade war?
yes, please, and then we'll.
I think the trade war, I'll tell you what I think about the trade war. I think that what's happened fundamentally is that America, it's not just about Trump, it's about the American governing class. America had made 2 assumptions about its relationship with China, that it would always be the dominant player in the relationship, that China would over time westernize and become like the West, and that China would accept American leadership indefinitely. And of course, on all of those fronts, they got it wrong. And the reason why there's been this shift, which is not just Trump, but the Democrats as well, is because America cannot imagine a world, cannot bring itself to think of a world in which it's not number 1. And that is, I think, the stark reality of the problem. So I think this is a very important moment where something that the Chinese have assumed since 1972 and the Nixon-Mao Accord, that they could get on together, you know, through thick and thin, through disputes and so on. Basically, there was a stable relationship. And I think that's over. And I think it's over for a long time. I mean, Jack Ma said 20 years. I think that's not bad
He
thinking,
said he thinks a
to be
trade
honest
war
with
could
you.
last 20
I think
years.
that's the kind of
And he
situation we're
cancelled
now
a
in.
million jobs he was going
And
to
you
create.
see, we've not talked about America, you see, but what Trump's doing now is what America did most of its history, basically. The only period it didn't behave like that was during the Second World War.
And afterwards.
And afterwards, up until now. Now that's it's a long period, 70 years, but America's existed for a lot longer than that. And basically, so America is reverting historically to how it's behaved. And so I don't think we should be surprised. When we think about it, we shouldn't be so surprised that this reversion has taken place. And just one thing. You see, I think the Chinese didn't see it coming.
Okay.
That seems to be acknowledged by many.
I think that they were caught off balance.
That's obviously
They were
been acknowledged
just a
well
quick-
in Beijing as well.
Yeah.
I mean, my biggest worry in this is, okay, we're talking about China being as an external force, as being a great power. But on the other hand, if we're judging by the Chinese foreign policy, how many percentage which are domestic politics and how many percentage which are foreign? I mean, the answer is probably 99% of all the Chinese foreign policy derived from domestic politics. And therefore, obviously, domestic priorities, that's the most pressing issues they need to resolve. But on the other hand, if China put into that sense of the so-called great power notion, and they require itself to behave in a certain way, like the great power, and how that's going to balance out what they really need to do domestically. So that's the squares, the circle they need to square, which I found, is almost an unanswerable question for anyone, irrespective of what views they have. I'm sure you all really agree with me on that point.
Well, we do.
We do. Okay. The floor is open. It's been a fantastically, I think, stimulating discussion so far. If you'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. There'll be a microphone coming around. I'd be so grateful if you would introduce yourself and who you'd like to answer the question. In the interest of time, I'm going to collect 3 questions, and then we'll let the panel answer. But you have the mic, so it's you get to go.
So thank you very much for the talk. My name is Jacques, and this is a general question.
Okay.
It's about how did and does policy choice as well as government structure affect the total factor productivity in China relative to other countries, and what are the pros and cons of this approach? Thank you.
Sorry, I'm not quite sure I got that.
No,
Can you repeat the first part, please?
So how does policy choice and government structure affect
Government structure.
TFP,
Okay.
total factor productivity in China
Okay.
compared
So,
to other countries?
yeah, so
and
how
pros and
does
cons.
Structure and responsibility.
government structure
Affect what?
and policy choice
Policy
affect
choice.
China? Okay.
Abstract
Uh,
question.
And is it
do that.
okay if we collect 2 more? Yeah, there's a mic here. Great.
My name is Professor Raj Bansali. I spent 3 years in China working. I'd like to sort of shift the balance away from the macro discussion that's been going on to how all the development that people have talked about affected ordinary Chinese people. And I think the situation is rather bleak on that front. For example, housing is a major problem. Also, education is far from satisfactory. People work all hours, very little leisure. All these factors, I think, would build up at some point and lead to some sort of, I think the worrying Chinese government part is some sort of a revolution, right? Some sort of stability or change in something. And I think it needs to be addressed at greater length.
Thank you. Great. And then the question at the end.
We've got a question on
Yeah, because
Hi, my name is Tom. Sorry to take it back to a foreign policy sort of level. What do you make of the sort of South China Sea situation and the military build-up there, and Martin specifically, like the sort of positive message that you're giving of China as a global power and as, you know, a rival to the United States. How does that square with some of the stuff that you've written about race and identity and how that might play out with China as a global power when you think of it, when you're saying it's quite a positive thing?
Thank you.
Did you say race and identity?
Yeah.
Okay. Actually, Martin, why don't we start with you on that question, on both of those? So, race and identity issues.
Yeah, why don't I do that? And then
why don't you
George
start? And then why don't you start, and I'll direct the other questions. And then South China Sea. Does that sit within your depiction of how China is affecting the world?
Well, I've got something to say about it.
Floor is yours.
I think that there's a lot of things to say about it, really. I mean, the Chinese have a different conception of how the question of both the sea and the islands, the island features, should be determined. Their position is historic rights as the primary consideration. Three of the other claimants based their claims essentially on territorial rights, as in post-1945 maritime legislation. But there are two other countries that also base their claim on historic rights, which is often just been ignored more or less in the media here, which are Vietnam and Taiwan. The two countries that don't, most obviously, are the Philippines and Malaysia. Now, I don't think this question is going to be resolved on the basis of what I call the Western position. I don't think it's ever going to get resolved on those terms. It's not going to be resolved on the basis of law either, because there is no body that actually can sanction these questions, because UNCLOS does not have the power to do that. It can express a view, which is what it did in the Hague judgment on the Philippines question. And I think there's kind of stalemate, broadly speaking, in the South China Sea. But China has a very good relationship with the ASEAN countries, by and large. The worst relationship is with Vietnam, but that's a complicated relationship which goes back thousand years at least. The relationship with the Philippines was transformed by the election of Duterte within a month or two of the Hague judgment, when Duterte said it's just a piece of paper, which is more or less what Dai Bingguo, the previous state counsel on foreign affairs, said of it as well. And so I think that in the long, what do I think that's going to happen? How do you think? I'll tell you how I think it'll get resolved, but this is just total speculation on my part, okay? And that is, the Chinese, believe in put sovereignty on one side and engage in joint development. This was particularly Deng Xiaoping's position. He proposed it in relationship to the dispute with the Japanese over the Senkaku or Diaoyu Islands, yeah. And for a period, the Japanese were interested in it, but unfortunately, it didn't happen. And it's something it's something they agreed with the North Koreans as well, but in an earlier period. I think that what will happen is that in some way or other, that will be the resolution of this question. The Chinese can't retake the islands. They've never tried to retake any islands. So although they've got a claim over all the islands, they're never going to be able to get all the islands. But what they could do is have a major new agreement, but on a bilateral level, because the Chinese won't do it multilaterally. They'll do it on a bilateral level. So that's what I think is going to happen. Now, just to add, and George says it in the book, he talks about the militarization of the South China Sea by the Chinese occupying these islands. Now, listen, the South China Sea is militarized. The Seventh Fleet is there. There is usually an American aircraft carrier and a convoy of ships constantly in the South China Sea. They have been buzzing along the 200-mile limit of the China southern coast from Hainan for many years now. So, you know, I mean, I'm not saying whether the Chinese were within their rights to reclaim it. Whether they were wise to do it is another matter.
Okay, we've got lots of questions.
I didn't do race. I'll come back.
I think if I'm going to ask each of you to address each of the other two questions, because there are a lot of questions. I want to make sure we get to them. So, Cherry, if I could just have, I know these are difficult to do shortly, but we could do briefly. The question from the gentleman here about how the Chinese people are faring, whether the current system might lead to instability or something else. If you could just address that one.
Sure. Okay. Obviously, talking about which part of China we're talking about in here. Are we talking about those who live in Beijing, or are we talking about those who live in the countryside? And of course, the needs and wants are completely different, and therefore your expectation from the government are very much different as well. And I mean, really, even to connecting on the other question on the governance and policy choices as well. At the end of the day, what really matters is whether those people have food to eat and whether the annual salary has been increased. I mean, these are the two things, major concern for any ordinary government as such at all. But now, if we come back to the question on ordinary people's life, and what are the priority for Xi Jinping? Earlier this year, he's talking about the three major risks, and he tried to dismount by the end of the year. So the first one, furthermost, which will be environmental and pollution issues. And that impacts on everyone. Again, I like to try to use that phrase, which is, again, is a populist agenda for the Chinese Communist Party. And then if we're talking about the other policy choices in terms of GDP and the green growth, and which one China will cite. And clearly, Xi Jinping made it very clear he wants to have a much more qualitative-driven growth, which means less high on numbers, but completely really concerned for the ordinary people's life. So I think he shows some positive sign, obviously care about ordinary people and what are the people thinking about him. But on the other hand is, if you have such an embedded system with a large number of vested interest groups on every single strand of the policy making, and how he's going to play that jockey game with many others. So when you ask me again on this question on the policy choice,
I'm going to give that one to George.
It's more about by default.
So we can
sometimes it's more about by default rather than really by the rational choice. So it's not really rational choice, but it's more about ad hoc and responsive style of making policies.
Do you have anything to add to that, George, before we open it up?
Because you said something about in China relative to other countries?
In terms of policy choices in the structure of government, yes, right? Correct. Yeah.
So you mean, is policy making more efficient or better
how
in China
compares,
relative
right?
to other countries?
From an economics perspective, what are the consequences of having this type of government system compared to...
Oh, right, okay. Well, okay, a couple of, just two observations. They're really basically empirical observations. The first is, you cannot dispute that the Chinese system has delivered unprecedentedly fast economic growth, which no other, certainly since 1945, no other emerging country has even come close to that for any lengthy period of time.
Actually, no other country has come
no other
close.
country,
It's
yeah.
the only country that's had 4 decades of sustained growth. There's only 2 countries that have had 3 decades, and that's South Korea and
Taiwan.
Taiwan.
Yeah, well, at least measured on official statistics.
Yes.
So you can't knock that, obviously. But I kind of emphasize again that you have to look beneath that and find out why did it happen and what were the critical success factors and where are we today relative to where we were in the 1980s and the 1990s, for example. And obviously the bigger question really is that we are all having this kind of navel gazing at the moment. about what is the right mix in our society between state-led or state-nurtured development and prosperity and markets. So we're looking at it from one point of view, post the financial crisis, but in China, believe me, they're looking at it from the other point of view, and it's not clear, that the markets guys are going to win. I mean, I don't mean open markets, but there is a kind of a nuance between how much reform you're going to allow, and I don't think these guys are on the front foot at the moment.
Okay. We've got a lot of questions, so I know there are several hands up there, so if we can collect these three, the gentleman in the back, the lady, and then the gentleman there. And I know I've got you, and I've got you. So we're going to try and squeeze in 2 rounds if everyone try to keep their questions brief and their responses brief. So go ahead, please.
Dan is my name. Regarding Taiwan, does China want it in the fold for geopolitical, historical, or economic reasons? And where do you see this playing out in the next 5 years?
Thank you. And the question here from the lady there. No, sorry, the lady there. Yeah.
Thanks very much. My name's Nerys Avery. It's a question for whoever wants to answer it. It's been clear that China's got a different political system, and that you have mentioned that it wants to find its own way of development, and that it's, despite the political system and everyone wanting China to be like the West, it hasn't, and it's succeeded so far. But for how long can China continue to sort of, I wouldn't say defy, but to have this success and defy the laws of economics, which seem to indicate from George's book that at some point there's going to be some kind of economic event. So can China defy that, or is it just going to become subject to the laws of economics, and at some point it's just, despite the political system, it's going to fall into that trap?
Thank you. And then the microphone to the gentleman there. Thank you.
Hello, my name's Andrew Mason, and I work for an investment bank. But a long time ago, I was a historian. So my question is a little bit history side. I think it's fair to say that no communist country has ever been as successful as China. I think that's more important perhaps than no other country. But my interest is actually on Martin's element about colonialism. It's true that China couldn't be described as a colonial country in 19th century terms, but perhaps we could actually brand it a neo-colonial country, because firstly, the way the Chinese act when they're in those countries, there's a lot of concern about that. They do actually end up lauding it as lords and masters on the whole. That's one element. And secondly, here's my historical illusion. Certainly, let's not look at the British Empire, the German Empire, the Japanese Empire even, but I want to go even further back. And there is a historical closeness to the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire started not with colonial states, but with client states. And these states, the Romans were very keen on lending them money. They were very, very good at it. But often...
And they built a lot of roads.
Yes, and no, 1 second. And often people couldn't pay money back.
That's right, on the road.
That led to colonialism. So
Thank you.
Are we actually looking at a neo-colonial state?
Thank you very much. Great questions. Brief answer so we can get in the last 3 people. So Martin, you're going to have to answer that one. Is the Chinese approach more of a neo-colonial, Roman Empire-esque?
Yeah, no, I've already had a little go at that. I want to have Taiwan historical. 5 years.
All right.
5 years, nothing.
Okay, so next.
Wait a minute. With such breath.
I know that was fast. We're gonna move on. No, seriously, there's anything you want to add on that, Martin, on Taiwan? That was it.
Right, can I just...
That was it. Okay, on Taiwan.
No.
You're good.
I was going to answer the lady's question.
Okay, Jerry.
Right, okay, let me adding something on Taiwan then. Well, just using his line, every 3 Taiwan businessmen going to play golf with a mainland businessman in mainland China. So the business link has just been too intrinsically intertwined, and I don't really see a potential conflicts.
Okay. Why don't you take the neo-colonial one, and then I'll go to you on the defy economic gravity.
Yeah.
I mean, in terms of new colonialism, I haven't really had enough study on this, but my question would be, my judgment would be, would you categorize as colonial, whether it's a benevolent colonialist or malevolent colonialist? Think about Taiwan. Taiwan is a classic that benevolent colonist, made by Japan and developing a modern state. So Taiwanese are eternally grateful for what Japanese has done. Depends on how where do you put your standard on colonization?
Okay. George, crisis in China?
I mean, first of all, I think from an economic point of view, that economic laws of gravity can't be defined. It doesn't really matter what your political system is. And I think that China has tools which it can deploy to basically keep some of the worst or most egregious forms of crisis at arm's length. So, I mean, in my book, we talk extensively about the debt, which is the most pressing of the traps that I talk about. And I don't think, China is going to have a Lehman's type of, actually, you know this, you've heard me say this before. I don't think it's going to have a Lehman's sort of financial crisis because no banks are going to go bust, or no major banks are going to go bust in China. It's a state-owned banking system. The shadow banks are largely conventional bank-owned, not totally, but largely. And I think it's just too risky from the point of view of stability. And, at the 19th Congress, one of the first, and we talked about environment and about income inequality, but financial stability, following the authoritative source, blah, blah, blah. I mean, it is big priority. I think actually incrementally they're backing away from it at the moment because the economy is kind of slowing down a little bit. So, but I think that, China will bear the manifestations of misallocation of resources, but without experiencing financial meltdown.
Okay. With the forbearance of Asia House, could I do one quick final round and we'll finish by 8?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. In that case, everyone I'm going to point to now has to ask your question in 30 seconds, and then we're going to impose discipline on the panelists. So the lady there, you nearly had the mic earlier, so you must get it now. And then I know you've been trying to ask a question here. Actually, I think we're just going to do these two, and then 1 minute answers, just so we can. So this gentleman here, Anna. Actually, the lady first.
Hi, this question is for George. I'm curious about your thoughts on China's focus in aggressively investing in technology and AI and becoming much more of an innovator rather than relying simply on technology transfer, and what role that might play, if any, in sparking the next surge in TFP and helping China escape the middle income trap that you foresee for it.
Thank
you haven't read the book, have you?
Okay, and then just the gentleman here, and that's it. Yeah.
My question is, Linda, direct to you, rather than avoiding the conflicting minds.
Okay.
What is going to be the...
Am I going to regret this?
What is going to be the effect of this trade war at grassroots level and common man on both countries?
Okay, thank you. Okay. Right, so George.
Should I do the quick one? Yeah. Oh God, I know. No, I'm not sure I can answer this in 30 seconds. It's absolutely critical. Right? Again, without wanting to get too nerdy about it, what artificial intelligence, big data, robotics basically signify is, if you put them all together, is what we call a general purpose technology. So it's like electricity or, the internet or something that basically, changed the world because it then went on. It wasn't just the scientific and engineering achievements that actually marked them out. It was how they spawned multiple innovation across a broad range of industries and sectors and so on and so forth. So I have very little doubt, based on what we think we can see. I'm not a scientist, but what we think we understand and what scientists report is that China is making huge progress in. It's probably a world leader now in mobile payment systems and in e-commerce, right, or aspects of e-commerce. In other areas, whether it's university, AI, instruction, or the number of AI engineers, or business-facing integration with technical parks and so on and so forth. There's quite a lot of this that you can read about, in which I have cited, in which China is now quite a lot further ahead in 2017 than it was in 2012. It is catching up. Of course, in the early stages, actually, you can do a lot of catch up, but it's still quite a long way behind in a lot of very important areas. So the question is really whether without the rule of law, without independent contract arbitration, with the absence of lots of things that we normally associate with this, can China kind of make that great? If it does, it will be the first to do so.
Okay. And then I guess the question to me was US-China trade war. I think at the grassroots level, consumers in both countries will face higher prices, even if it's just a few cents, which is always damaging. Intermediate products are also going to be more expensive. That's actually quite damaging, especially in a number of industries. My main concern about the trade wars aren't tariffs. Tariffs can be reversed tomorrow. It's when it affects firm investment decisions and the localization of supply chains, which America first is stressing. And China's Made in China 2025 plan is about indigenous innovation and their own innovation feeding into their own manufacturing. I think these economic and political forces within both countries are going to make investment distortions. And that, I think, is something that we all have to really watch out for. And then finally, will it resolve or get escalated? My guess is escalated for a while, because domestically, politically, both of what I've described is central to the policies of these countries. But the best outcome to reduce a trade deficit is to sell more stuff. It's not to make your imports more expensive. So I'm always hopeful that people will see the economic reasoning, in the end. Economists, we're not a pessimistic lot. We're actually quite optimistic, or I am anyways. But there's so much more to say. It's been a fantastic panel. Before I release you to go for the drinks and to get the answers to the questions you were not able to pose, George will be hanging around signing his new book, Red Flags, She's China in Jeopardy. I'm also going to be sitting in the corner signing my book, The Great Economists, with a chapter called Can China Grow Rich? And we'll look forward to discussing all these issues with you further over a drink. But before I release you to do so, I'd like to have a show of hands. How many of you think that China's new era under Xi Jinping, it represents progress? Show of hands. Okay. How many of you think it represents Jeopardy? Okay. So now you look around. You now have someone to talk to in the drinks next door. Thank you very much, and please join me in thanking this fantastic panel.
Thank you.